evening, everyone. Welcome to a very unique opportunity to hear from a very well-known professor from the University of Washington and the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. We are very blessed to have with us tonight Dr. Jerry Franklin. Help me welcome him here to Evergreen.
Well, it's great to get down here. I don't very often have the opportunity to get down to this campus. Just to give you just a little bit more background about me, I spent the first 30 years of my professional life working for the Forest Service. The Forest Service is kind of neat. Of course, they manage the National Forest System, but they also have a research organization, a research branch. Here in this Northwest, it's called the Pacific Northwest Research Station, based in Portland, but it has labs. It has one here in Olympia. And so I was fortunate to have the opportunity as an undergraduate to become a student trainee, as they called their co-op ed programs in those days. And so I had a career of 30 years doing research for the Forest Service. And it was really neat. The Forest Service separated its research organization from its management organization so that the management organization couldn't actually influence what it did or what it reported. And it really gave it a great deal of autonomy and credibility. And I will say that more than once, somebody in the National Forest System tried to get me fired. But they never could manage that, because as long as I stuck to the science and didn't get in policy, I was in good shape. They weren't going to get me. So anyway, and then I have had this chance now to spend time at the University of Washington. And I'm going to retire after about 30 years there this coming December 31st, so and then I don't know what the heck I'm going to do, but I'll find something to do, I'm sure. I was really fortunate, too, to have, first of all, while I was working for the Forest Service, an opportunity to grab a sack of money at the National Science Foundation that hung out there for a group of us, both academic and agency people at Corvallis, Oregon State University, where I was based, to do research on old growth forests. And it's something I'd wanted to do ever since literally I was a kid, because I discovered that, no one really knew anything about old growth forests. And I'd spent enough time in them that I really believed there had to be something special there, and we managed to snag this sack of money and spend about 15 years actually learning about the old growth forest. And it turned out to be even more significant than I imagined because of the fact it was the first time anyone here in the Northwest had ever looked at a forest, any kind of forest, as an ecosystem. And it's part of the story I want to tell you tonight about how, in my 60 years, we've gone from, absolutely no understanding of what a forest ecosystem really was to really having a pretty comprehensive view. I would never claim that we know everything, but I would claim that we've got a pretty good framework and an awful lot of pieces filled in for forest ecosystems and how they work. Not just old growth, but how forest systems in general work. So the other thing I was really fortunate in that, while I was with the Forest Service, I couldn't get into policy. That was the one rule about Forest Service scientists. You can report all the science you want, But the minute you start saying this is what the agency should do, you're out of line. And my shift to a university or an academic position in 1985 really provided that opportunity. And I spent, some really interesting times working for Congress and working for the White House, participating in the development of the Northwest Forest Plan. And I couldn't imagine I would ever be involved in policy, but indeed I was, and I enjoyed it tremendously. It was really a great experience. And that, was a real surprise for someone who went into forestry so they didn't have to deal with people. And one of the things you'll hear me say probably more than once tonight is forestry is a social science before it's anything else. And that's because we, the humans, make all the important decisions about that forest. And so forestry, any resource management activity is a social science before it's anything else. And it turns out it's always the social side of resource management that is the more difficult. The technical stuff is easy. You can solve that, but people are complicated. And they have opinions. And they express those opinions. And they want to influence outcomes. And that's, one of the real changes that's occurred in forestry and in resource management. So my idea of being a forester, going out in the woods, not having to deal with a bunch of people, turned out to be not true. Guess what? I got to deal with people. And I found it to be, really a challenging and enjoyable exercise. Now, I've got some things I want to say to you tonight about climate change and about federal forests, but I also would like to just hear from some of you about what you would like to hear about tonight. What do you think you're going to hear about, and what would you like to hear about? So who wants to stick their toe in the water here? Yeah.
So because you work with Clinton administration and other administrations, one of the things we're facing as a generation is how to talk to other people who don't believe in facts or in science. And so maybe some advice about that, or how you dealt with some of the adversaries that you dealt with when you got into policy. So.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
It's a tough one when you're dealing with, alternate facts. Okay, I'll try to at some point at least come back to that. Okay. It's not unlike a question that I had with an audience in New Jersey about 10 days ago. How do we learn to talk to each other? And that's a huge issue for our society right now, divided as we are. So, yeah, how do we do that? And incidentally, one of my basic premises is that I'm not going to ask people to change their beliefs. I am going to appeal to their sense of logic and their self-interest. And that was sort of a decision I made early on, that I wasn't going to try to change the basic set of values that you or anybody else has. What I am going to do is try to make you understand as well as I can what the forest is and how it's likely to respond to different kinds of treatments, and help you to understand how those might influence your interests and those of your sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters. So other people, feel very strongly about, I want to change your set of values, and I want you to adopt mine. That's a hard thing to do, and so without realizing that, I chose science as a way of, in fact, making sort of the case for the forest and the trees, and in hopes that when the people understood more about the forest, they would understand what you might logically do if you want certain kinds of outcomes. Now, we have another challenge in that sometimes people just don't want to listen to facts. And I'm not sure what to do about that other than to repeat them many times and as many arenas as possible. And try to make people see where it is really in their interest as human beings. So, gee, that's a good one. What other people want me to cover tonight? Would like to be sure that I addressed? Or do you want me to just start talking? Yeah.
I'm interested in hearing where you think the Northwest Forest Plan is going to go in the future.
Where the Northwest Forest Plan is going to go in the future. I can do that. And that is something very important for all of you to be thinking about because you're going to influence where it goes. And so, yeah, be glad to do that. Other? All right? Oh, yeah.
I just would like to give comments on actually a recent article that we read.
Oh, the science article?
Where you are proposing, well, the way the author put it was that you were proposing that we change our opinion about how we harvest old growth forests. And what my concern was is that people who don't really understand the ecology of those forests might take that as a cue to go in and cut them all down and use that as an argument. And how do you see that? I'd like to hear.
Sure. And incidentally, there were some good things about that article and some bad things about the article. And one of the bad things about the article was the author didn't make it clear that my collaborator, my main collaborator, has been a wonderful fellow by the name of Norm Johnson down at Oregon State University. We don't advocate any harvest of old forests at all. And the only harvesting that we've ever advocated, and this is both for ecological and for economic reasons, is plantations. We don't advocate active management of any older forests at all, and only places where we've previously harvested. Okay? And I don't think, he didn't make that clear in the article, did he? That was one of the things that really upset me about it. So we obviously, don't have, we're well below the historic range of variability in the amount of mature and old forests we have. And so we obviously, that's not the place for us to go to do active management. And on the other hand, we've created in the last 50 years, hundreds of thousands of acres of plantations. And some of those we're going to let grow into old forests. In fact, we're going to go in and thin those to accelerate the development of structural complexity in a lot of cases. But even after you account for that, and that's a lot of acres, we still have a lot of hundreds of thousands of acres of plantations out there. And what we do with those is really going to determine what the future of the national forest is. So the old growth's off the table, people. It's off the table. There's no rationale, ecological or economic, for going into those forests. The real issue that has to be addressed on the national forest is what do we do here in the Douglas fir region with regards to the previously harvested forests, the plantations, which are there in both excess, way, way more young forest than we've ever had historically in this region. And of course, are also not very natural. They're plantations. So anyway, that perhaps gets us a little ways into that. I certainly wanted to make that clear to you folks, that we aren't talking about going in and cutting older forests. In fact, we aren't going to cut any more older forests anywhere in the Northwest, because all of the older forests are either on the federal lands, or DNR has some, and they've taken theirs off the table. They aren't going to harvest old forests either. And we also have various lands that have been purchased for conservation purposes. And so essentially the old growth's off the table. And hopefully not even the Trumpies will be able to put it back on the table, okay? And so the question then is what we do with areas that have been previously harvested in the case of the national forest. And I think, you know, I can make a case with you that one of the really missing components of our forest ecosystem here is the complex early successional forest. And believe me, I didn't intend to go there. I didn't want to go there. And it was Mount St. Helens that helped me to go there because one of the things that we learned at Mount St. Helens, it was just one of the epiphanies that I had because of Mount St. Helens, was that holy smokes, this big disturbed area that we had there is the most biologically diverse patch of ground in the Cascade Range. What? This disrupted, disturbed, ugly, beat up system that had this volcano throw up all over it? Holy moly, how can that be? And it is because here in the Douglas fir hemlock region, that period of time between when a disturbance occurs, like a volcano or a fire, and when the closed forest canopy again develops, is a period which is incredibly rich in biological diversity. There's just so many different kinds of foods out there, and because there's all these foods out there, all these different shrubs and herbs and berries and nuts and all kinds of good things, you get really many, many food webs, okay, complex food webs. And so that's where, if you're a birder, you're likely to go there because that's where you're going to see a lot more of our neotropical migrant songbirds. And if you're a lepidopterist, a butterfly specialist, that's where you're going to go because there's going to be a lot more butterflies and moths out there. And I had been thinking, you know, oh, these are weedy environments. But they're not. They're really full of habitat specialists, species that need early successional conditions. And, oh, okay, well, surely someone's creating that. Maybe it's Weyerhaeuser. No, today, what were the corporate timberlands are now all owned and operated by TIMOs and REITs, real estate investment trusts, and timber investment management organizations. And their goal in managing those lands is to get a high level of return on their capital. And they count everything as capital, okay? Because you could sell it and get something for it, okay? So what's happened on the private industrial lands that once provided the wood for the mills is that they're now managed basically to provide a high return on investment, and it's all based on discounted present net value, and that means you can't grow that forest for very long. And so they manage it very intensively, particularly in Oregon, less degree here in Washington. They make very extensive use of herbicides. So tremendous site preparation, herbicide treatments. You plant the trees, and they're really fast-growing trees, and so very quickly you grow the stem back. Now, you don't grow it for very long, maybe 30 years, and then you cut it down and do it all over again. But guess what? There's no opportunity for early successional habitat. In fact, those foresters, if they could, they would have, the year after they harvested, full of trees again. Well, that doesn't provide any opportunity for brush, for these complex plant life form diverse early successional communities to develop. So that's not where they're going to be. So guess what? It's just like old growth. The only place you're going to get early success, complex, biologically rich early successional habitat is on the federal lands. They're the only ones that can do that, just like old growth. So the advocacy for doing some harvesting in the plantations has to do ecologically with providing that kind of early successional habitat. Providing that opportunity for those plant life form diverse ecosystems to develop. What a forester would call brush, okay? And any of you that have hunted know, of course, that's where our ungulates are. That's where the elk are. That's where the deer are. So when I was taught to hunt deer as a kid, did I go out in the old growth forest? Heck no, I went in the Ecological burn because that had that kind of suitable habitat. Well, I got diverted right away. But anyway, let me go back and start over where I wanted to start, and we'll see if I don't deal with some of the topics you want to. You can bring me back. So, lately I've been writing a book, a big, thick book called Ecological Forest Management. It'll be out in January. And in the process of doing that over the last 3 or 4 years, I've really reflected a lot on my 60 years in the profession and what I was taught when I was sitting where you are and what I think and know now, 60 years later. And it's really amazing. And one of the really dramatic changes has been our understanding about forests as ecosystems. Now, if you go back 60 years, basically, the forester viewed a forest as a collection of trees. Okay? It's a collection of trees. That's what a forest is. And basically, we had a series of tenets or basic premises about our profession. And the first one of those was that basically this collection of trees is to be managed to produce wood. That's the highest and best purpose of managing forests. That's why we do it. And so that's what we did. And at that point in time, there was a real belief there was going to be a timber famine. We're going to run out of timber. We really got to get in there and work to get more timber growing so we don't end up running out of timber. And so that was the forester's perspective. My job is to manage a collection of trees in a way that is going to produce timber on a sustainable basis. Now, the forester probably realized there were some other values there. But even if the forester was thinking about that, and it was a he at the time, incidentally, then he wouldn't have really had any body of knowledge to draw on. So what else is out? I don't know what else is out there. I don't know what relationship it has to the trees. What we'd been doing was studying, of course, trees and how to grow trees, how to plant trees. So we really hadn't been studying the forest. We've been studying some trees and how to grow them as a crop. And no one had the inclination or in fact the resources to think about the forest as a system. And that all has changed in the 60 years that I've been working. And now we really have an understanding of how complex these forests are, how incredibly rich they are in biological diversity, and what a rich set of services and goods they provide for us and how they do it. And it's really quite amazing you know, that these forests of ours are capable of providing us with all of these different services. And one of the principles in that, incidentally, has to do with the fact that nature doesn't try to optimize anything. It doesn't try to optimize wood production or water yields or anything else. Basically, it does that kind of, it has that kind of capacity to provide all these values because, in fact, nothing is optimized, but everything is provided. And one of the mistakes that we tend to make as managers, and believe me, you can make that mistake too, is thinking, I'm going to manage the forest for X or Y or Z. I'm going to manage it to maximize timber production. Or I'm going to maximize reduction of fuel loadings for wildfire purposes. Or I'm going to maximize the amount of habitat that's out there for owls. So basically, nature doesn't optimize any outcome. And by failing to optimize for any, it provides for all of the values. Anyway, that poor forester didn't have the words, the concepts to be able to think about the forest as a system. And interestingly, none of the other resource managers did either. What did the wildlife people do? The wildlife people were interested in things you could shoot. Okay? Game. And what was one of the rules of the wildlife manager? Go to Leopold's 1935 book on wildlife management. Control the predators. And so, you know, that was how wildlife management people viewed their system. It was about game, and anything that impacted the game negatively, you tried to control, get rid of. Fisheries people the same way. These people were working with fish. What was their view? Well, they were either thinking about commercial fishery or sport fishery. So they went around planting fish in all of these lakes and ponds and didn't ever have them without a thought for how you might be impacting the food webs in that system, the trophic system that is part of that natural system. So my point is simply that 60 years ago, we were not in a position to think about our natural resources from the standpoint of an ecosystem. Today, we are. And it's fascinating how resource managers were often very resistant to that concept. But amazingly, some people and some important policymakers in our country recognized that and began to realize that we were dealing with ecosystems. And so they began to pass laws that in fact ultimately forced us to approach our federal lands from the standpoint of an ecosystem. Now, some people get a lot of credit for it. Incidentally, of course, one of them is Aldo Leopold, although Leopold didn't have the language of the ecosystem. So he called it the land. And believe me, he was no preservationist. He believed in active management of these systems, even as he was at the same time a founder of the Wilderness Society. And one of the keys was Rachel Carson, who wrote a book way back in the 50s called Silent Spring. And that had a powerful influence on the United States Congress, which at that time was a deliberative body, and which then proceeded to begin to pass a series of laws which in fact actually necessitated adoption of an ecosystem-based approach to management, because there was no other way that you could accomplish the goals that they set out in the Endangered Species Act, in the National Forest Management Act of 1976. And there's a wonderful book I wanted to call your attention. If you want to know how a lot of this stuff came about. There's this book, Federal Ecosystem Management, by a fellow by the name of Skillen. I don't know him, but he wrote a wonderful book here that talks about federal resource management policy and how it came to be. It also has some of the, probably one of the more accurate descriptions of how the Northwest Forest Plan came about. And so, you know, if any of you want to pursue this, it is wonderful that, in fact, the policymakers got ahead of the resource managers. And, you know, it really turned out to be very difficult for the forestry profession, as an example, to finally accommodate the reality that they were not dealing with a collection of trees. On federal lands, they're dealing with an ecosystem. Great book. I recommend it. It was very useful to me, and one of the things I learned as a result of this was the difference between laws that are processed, require a process, and laws that require a substantive outcome. So NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, is in fact a process-based law. It says you have to do certain things. You have to do an environmental analysis, and you have to tell the truth, but you can do bad things anyway. Okay? But you just have to be square with the public about what you're going to do and have done an analysis of it and reported it. It's a process. ESA, Endangered Species Act, and the National Forest Management Act of 1976 are substantive laws. That is, to meet the requirements of those laws, you must produce an outcome which is scientifically credible and legal under existing law. Okay? Wow, that's tough. That's not a process. That's tough. And this relates in part to the Northwest Forest Plan revision. You know, that's a challenge. How do you meet those requirements of being, in fact, scientifically credible and legal and fulfill the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act in terms of a public process? Now, when we did the Northwest Forest Plan, did we do it in a public arena? Well, we did not develop the alternatives that were considered in a public process. In fact, we were sequestered away in a 10-story building down in Portland, Oregon, the Pink Tower, we called it. And basically, to produce scientifically credible alternatives that could be considered in an analysis, we did that essentially in scientific isolation. We were isolated from all of the stakeholders. Now that later went into a NEPA-based process where the public got to look at it and scream about it. But in any case, one of our challenges in revising the Northwest Forest Plan is we want it to be a process that involves participation of all the stakeholders. But how do you do that and at the same time come up with alternatives which meet the requirements of being legal and scientifically credible? It's hard to do in a glass tower. Okay? So just something to think about. So anyway, in working on this book, I got to think about all these things that have evolved. And, you know, one other thing that really has changed, and I alluded to it already, is the wood products industry. And, you know, when I was growing up, back in the pre-Reagan days, we had a vertically integrated wood products industry. Okay, what that meant was we had companies that owned forest lands that they managed with great care to provide the raw material that they needed in their processing facilities. So They grew the wood out there in the forest, and they used that wood to provide the primary sources of raw material for their mills. And we don't have that anymore, and partly because we now have a global capital marketplace. Basically, anyone who's participating in that global marketplace has to be thinking constantly about return on capital. How much return can they provide an investor on capital? And sooner or later it was going to happen, but we changed the tax law in the United States without any thought about forest lands at all. And when we did that, lo and behold, it became extremely advantageous for these corporations to separate the forest land from the processing facilities, the mills. And so our most productive forest land in this state and in the United States became the properties of TMOs and REITs, partnerships, investment groups which are managing that land to maximize the return on their capital. Not to grow the most wood possible, not to provide wood to the local industries, but in fact to produce wood with the maximum rate of return that they need and selling it on a global marketplace. So where does a lot of our wood go today from private forest lands in the Northwest, Oregon and Washington? It goes on boats, gets on boats, goes to China because they sell it to the highest bidder in terms of who's willing to pay the most. So maybe your mill in Darrington, maybe your mill in Stevenson goes without wood because they can't compete with China or Japan or Korea or Taiwan for that wood. So a major change in how our most valuable forest lands are going to be managed. And the way they manage them now is what we call in our book production forestry. And very simply, it's an agronomic approach. It's like a farmer uses to grow a crop. So it's an agronomic model, and but it's constrained by the need for a certain level of return on capital, which means you can't grow it for very long. Okay? So that's production forestry. And that's the counterpoint in our book to ecological forestry, which is managing forests according to natural models. Okay? And that's what our book is all about. And it turns out, interesting, that if you look around the world, not very much of the forest land can actually provide a sufficient return to be managed for capital generation. So here in the United States, there's only two places that can actually produce wood at a sufficiently high level to, in fact, be worth people investing in it, people that are involved in the capital market. One is the Northwest, here, west side, Douglas fir hemlock. Okay? The other is the southeastern United States. These are the only two places in the United States, in North America, where you can compete. Most of course, this kind of forestry is being done in the southern hemisphere. A lot of it's being done in places like Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Chile, South Africa, using essentially pines and eucalyptus. Brazil, you've got to mention Brazil too. So basically what we've done in our book is to try to define ecological forest management, managing forests based on natural models, and with the goal of fundamentally maintaining the integrity of these forest systems, all the forest systems. We are not going to sacrifice the capacity of any of these systems in pursuit of maximizing any one outcome. Okay? So that gives you a little bit of a background. And incidentally, most forest landowners, forest managers, people that deal with forests actually aren't interested in that kind of capital-intensive forestry called production forestry. Why was that? Because most of the forest estate in the world is actually held by organizations, by governments, by people who want multiple values from their lands. And this includes the private landowners. In the United States, 50% of our forest land is owned by small, non-industrial private forest landowners. Half of the forest lands in the United States. Many polls have been taken of their values. Why do you care about your land? Why do you care about that back 40 or that 160 acres you've got? And never is economics the most important single value. In fact, it's usually 4, 5, or 6 down the list of values. People do it. They do it for aesthetic reasons. They do it because of the wildlife that they enjoy. They do it. They do it also for economic reasons because they do need some financial return. But they aren't thinking about it as capital that they need a certain level of return on. But when the kids go to college, they need to know that they can begin to cash in some of that value, send the kids to school, and they're going to need some income in order to pay for the taxes and insurance and those kinds of things. Now, my point is simply that most forests in the world, people value for many values. They are not primarily managing those properties for return on investment. And in fact, they want to manage them in a way in which they will be able to sustain the broader array of values that they're interested in. And ecological forestry is a way to do that. Now, just maybe we'll diverge for just a moment and just mention one other book. You know, sometimes my preservationist friends say, oh, wow, that's great. You know, we could manage 8 or 10% of the forest estate for this high-yield forestry, this production forestry stuff, and then we can preserve the rest of it. You think that's what we can do with the other 90% of our forest? You think that's going to work? It's nonsense. The vast majority of the remaining forest estate is going to belong to somebody who needs to get some values from that, who wants to get some values from it. And they don't want to have to dispose of that land. They want to be able to keep it. So, obviously then, you know, the question is, what do you do with it? And again, you know, there's a tendency for us to think, you know, well, you got a forest out there, there's only 2 things you can do with it. You can make a preserve out of it, or you can make a plantation out of it. Plantations and protected areas. And, you know, particularly with regards to the public lands, there seems to be that kind of debate. That, you know, you only got 2 choices, people. Either we cut it and make it into a plantation, or else it's going to be a preserve. And in fact of the matter, there is a huge array of alternative possibilities. And interestingly, you know, as I look back on it, the hardcore timber people and the hardcore preservationists fighting over it, they agree. They agree that they want the world divided up into plantations and preserves. And the only difference of opinion is how much should be which. Otherwise, they don't have any suggestions for an alternative that might provide for a whole array of ecological values would be neither strict preserves nor plantations. And that's what ecological forestry is about. As I finished up the book, I found this little book, wonderful book. This is published by, of all people, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It's a book called Plantations in Protected Areas. It's by a social scientist in Australia. And I found this book and I leafed through it and I thought, oh wow, he arrived at the same conclusion I arrived at, that is a false dichotomy. And incidentally, I wanted to mention it to you because this is one of the most important things we need to tell everybody. The media, the policymakers, the politicians. This is false. We don't have to make a choice between plantations and preserves, especially now that, for example, we've taken the old growth forests off the table. We aren't talking anymore about cutting those. Maybe in the old days when that was the fight, that was appropriate. But today, it's not. And there are many alternatives to this dichotomy. So I would encourage you to think about this, and if you agree with me, get the word out. Get the word out, because the vast majority of the forest estate is going to be managed in some other way. Or, if it's not, it will probably be disposed of. Okay? That's the outcome if we don't, in fact, learn to manage these ways and provide these values, including the economic returns that these private landowners need. Okay, I haven't even gotten hardly to talking about forests, but let me talk a little bit about northwestern forests. And you know this probably really well, but I'm going to go over it at least briefly again. One of the really important things you need to know about the forests of the state of Washington is that there are fundamentally two kinds. And one of the kinds, are these kind of west side Douglas fir hemlock forests that are magnificent forests. And of course, particularly, I would say the old growth are particularly magnificent, but basically they have incredible capacity for growth and for richness and complexity. And so we know these west side forests, we know how absolutely massive they can be. And part of that is because they're very productive, but there are other forests that are as productive and aren't as beautiful. And part of the reason they are the magnificent forests that they are is because of the species. And we have species that persist for a very long time period and continue to grow for centuries. Okay? Douglas fir, fantastic example of that, but by no means the only one. We've got the largest representative of almost every coniferous genera that's represented out there. True firs, hemlocks, spruces, whatever, pines, name it. It's here in the Pacific Northwest. So, also, these darn trees not only live a long time and grow big, but when they die, a lot of them are very decay resistant. And so you end up with a forest out there that is just the greatest accumulation of carbon, organic materials that exists anywhere. And it is a combination of the big living trees, but also all of that down wood, all of that standing dead in the form of snags and all of that down wood. And those Douglas fir logs take centuries to decay away. So when a Doug fir dies, it doesn't go away. It takes about as long for it to go away as it did to get there in the first place. So, magnificent forest. And very interesting as well from the standpoint of their dynamics. So what is the disturbance regime of that forest? What's the major disruptor of our Douglas fir hemlock forest? What is it? You know what it is. Fire! You bet. Although wind, the biggest single disturbance event we've ever had in the Douglas fir forest was the Columbus Day windstorm, 1962. So we get wind too, but fire. But you know, fire doesn't come very often. They used to call these the asbestos forests because it's so damn hard to get them to burn. Have you ever tried to start a fire on a rainy day out there in the middle of an old-growth Douglas fir forest? It is horrendous. It is really, really difficult. You think sometimes you're going to die because you can't get the damn fire started. But anyway, they were known as asbestos forests because they didn't burn very often. But they do burn. We have calculated, you know, a natural fire return interval, and this is just an average, that typically is from 200 to 450 years. Depends on where you are in Oregon and Washington, and as you go south, the interval is shorter. As you go north, the interval is longer, but they don't burn very often. But you know what? When you get the right circumstances, they burn ferociously because, of course, they're loaded with fuel. Man, there's a lot of carbon out there, a lot of organic matter, just waiting for those carbon bonds to be released in those molecules. So, what are the conditions? Well, typically, we get the big fires, and they are typically large fire events with significant high severity component to them. Basically, we get them when we get a combination of having some ignitions out there, there's some fires going out there, perking along, and dry east winds. Okay, the synoptic weather pattern that generates those extremely dry, hot east winds from the interior. And we actually had some this year. Not so much up here, but in Oregon, we had that situation where we had ignitions and we got the east winds, and boy, did we get a lot of fire really fast. Fortunately, the winds didn't blow for very long, but they burned a lot of territory in about a day and a half. So that's the circumstances. And then, when you have these fires, now typically you get a big fire burning over a number of days, it's going to produce all kinds of fire effects. So some people want to call it a mixed severity fire. But the really important thing about it is that you had a high severity component to that fire that essentially killed all or most of the trees in the stand. Now there'll be patches of unburned areas and medium burned areas and lightly burned areas as well. So it is a mixed because it's burned over varying conditions of weather and nighttime and daytime and so forth. But you have essentially a lot of high severity fire which starts things over again. And you get the development of the forest recurring. And it goes on for centuries if we don't get another fire. So basically, what does it start with? Well, it starts with that pre-forest period, that early successional period, when there's no trees, or very few trees, present on the site. So it's open, and it's structurally rich. It's got a lot of dead material, snags and down logs. And boy, oh boy, the herbs and then the shrubs come, and you get these incredibly rich communities. And I like to think, you know, those other plants are saying, hallelujah! Those damn evergreen conifers are gone for a while. I can do something. And basically that period of time often lasts, under natural conditions, for 30 to 50 years. So there's a significant period when the new forest is establishing itself and growing up. Because Douglas fir isn't a real fast starter. It's a relatively slow starter as trees go. Okay, so we get that pre-forest period, maybe it's 30, 40, 50 years, could be longer. And that's the time when we have incredible biological diversity. Then we get a young forest. The canopy closes, the understory goes dark, most of that diversity goes away, and you better be a detritivore if you want to live in that forest, because there's not a hell of a lot of stuff to eat. You better either eat tree seeds or you better eat stuff that eats dead organic material. And you know, that goes on for maybe 80, 100 years. Dense forest, and it's growing like mad, accumulating biomass, but intense competition. And then, after about 100, 120 years of age, begins to open up. Some of that density is lost as the trees get bigger and the density of the stand is reduced, and you begin to again reestablish an understory in the stand. And there's another 100 years, which I call a mature forest, in which you essentially go from this young forest, which incidentally is top-loaded, almost nothing below, gradually over to an old forest, which incidentally is bottom-loaded and is extremely complex structurally. So young, mature, old. So a very long developmental sequence. Takes 200 to 300 years to get back to old growth, and then it may go on for a very long time if it's not disturbed again. So that's the nature of these Doug fir hemlock forests. They are boom and bust systems. Now it's a real contrast with the forests on the east side. And basically, under natural conditions, the pine forest and the mixed conifer forest, which typically is pine plus something else, like Doug fir or grand fir, basically were frequent fire forests, frequent fire landscapes. That means the fire really came frequently, like every 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. Fire was coming back to those systems. Now, if you take a forest and you put fire through it very frequently like that, it's powerful at influencing the composition and structure of that system. So what's it doing? Well, one of the things it's doing is taking out species that aren't very resistant to fire. Another thing it's doing, it's tending to take out the small trees rather than the big trees. And so it tends to be very selective in terms of resulting in a forest which is composed primarily of very fire-resistant species, ponderosa pine. And those trees that escape and become bigger and get thick bark and get their crown lifted up so that the fire can't get into it, boy, once they do that, hey, I can just perk along here for several hundred years. This is cool, all right? And so frequent fire tends to produce forests which are very savanna-like, low density, dominated by a few large diameter trees. 20 trees per acre will probably make up the vast majority of the basal area. Okay, well, guess what? When we came along, we decided, no, we don't like fire. And in fact, we did some other things to those forests, which covered a tremendous amount of the Intermountain region here in the western United States, but certainly the east side of the Cascades. So, first of all, we grazed the hell out of it. We ran millions of head of cattle and sheep through it. And then we logged a bunch of it. We started by logging the biggest and oldest trees first. Then we started logging everything out of it. And then we stopped fire because fire is bad. Well, you stop fire, and all of a sudden the forest begins to fill up. And all of those species that aren't so fire resistant, like grand fir, just come right back and begin to really grow up. And so what happened, we turned those very open, low density forests, which were very resistant to fire, we changed them into very dense forests and lots of small trees and lots of trees that have continuous canopy, so they provide fuels that get up into the top of the biggest trees and kill them. So when fire comes now, we have taken a forest that was very resistant, that had great continuity in time and space. Think about that. And we turned it into a boom and bust system. Well, we have the capacity, if we choose, to in fact return that system to a more resistant state. That's one of our challenges. But a tremendous difference then in the relationship of fire to the forest in the Douglas fir region and fire to the forest in the ponderosa pine and mixed conifer. What does that tell you? Well, one thing it should tell you is you can't have a single policy about fire, about old growth, about hardly anything that will work for both of those forests. They're very different. And this is a general principle, that when you look at you have to look at the different kinds of forests and their disturbance regimes and understand something about that in order to develop a credible policy for how you're going to manage it. And certainly that's one of the challenges today. And the scary thing is that there's a lot of people out there that aren't differentiating. Oh, we got dense forests, we'd better thin them out. Make them fire resistant. What happens if you try to make a Douglas fir forest fire resistant? You have something that isn't a Douglas fir hemlock forest anymore. And furthermore, you'd have to do something almost every 4 or 5 years, because if you do thin it out, it's going to try to grow right back up again because it's very productive. So that kind of policy, trying to create a resistant Douglas fir hemlock forest, is not credible. Creating a resistant ponderosa pine forest is credible. So, something to think about. One time, I was talking to Senator Wyden in Oregon, who's really been into these issues, and the senator said to me, "Jerry, don't tell me there are 50 different kinds of old growth forests. I can't deal with that. I can't make policy that way." And so I said, fine. But, Senator, you do have to understand that there are at least 2 major categories of forests that you have to have different policies for. One is the fire-frequent forest. The other is the forest that is disturbed infrequently, episodically, a boom and bust kind of forest. You can't develop a policy for old growth in the ponderosa pine that doesn't, in fact, recognize that you have to have some kind of a continuing disturbance to sustain it. Similarly, you have to understand that you can't develop a policy for Doug fir hemlock that makes it resistant to fire. Resilient, maybe, able to come back after a fire, but not to basically resist the fire and essentially not be subjected to change as a result. I hope you understand the difference between resistance and resilience. Resistance means you can take a hit and it doesn't do anything to you. Nothing changes. That was the ponderosa pine forest in the old days. Resilience is the ability to take a hit, get knocked flat, and go back and come back to essentially some approximation of the condition you were in previously. Douglas fir hemlock forests are resilient. They're not resistant, and you can't make them resistant. Ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests can be made resistant, and that's important in thinking about policy. So I wanted you to think about that difference between the frequent fire forest and the episodically disturbed forest, the boom and bust forest. Okay? I don't know why on the first day of forestry school somebody didn't say to me, you know, Jerry, you got to understand there's these two very different kinds of forests, produce very different kinds of outcomes. One of them has fire very frequently, one of them doesn't have it very frequently. That would have been very useful, but foresters in those days didn't accept the concept, the reality, the significance of a frequent fire forest. It wasn't maximizing productivity, for Christ's sake. There was a lot of open space out there. Let's fill it up. And we were going to do that. But we know better now. So, any questions about this? I got just 2 more subjects I want to cover quickly so we can get to questions. Yeah.
I'm curious, since old growth forests are such an important resource, should we suppress fire in them?
Ah, thank you. Thank you. We've come to think that we shouldn't suppress fire anywhere. Suppressing fire is a bad thing. Bullshit. Obviously, we want to keep our old forest here in the Douglas fir region as long as we possibly can. It's rare. It's essentially almost impossible to recreate, although we're growing some. We really are growing some. But under climate change, where we're likely to have more fire, it is logical to consider a policy of aggressive detection and suppression of fire in the Douglas fir hemlock forest. That is a logical thing to do, particularly where our natural forests remain, our mature and old forests remain. So, absolutely. Good. And I really wanted to say that because people seem to just go whoosh one way, suppress fire, and then all the way over to whoosh, don't ever suppress fire. And you don't want to get trapped in that. I am an advocate for aggressive detection and suppression of fire with regards to the old growth Douglas fir forest on the west side. Yeah.
How about on the ponderosa forest?
Ponderosa pine forest, suppression? No. In the ponderosa pine forest, what I advocate is an aggressive program of restoring resistance in those forests. Treating those forests to return them to the kind of historic structure that they had. And what we do after we restore them, whether we use fire, prescribed fire, or allow natural fire, or whether we essentially use an axe and a saw to do it, we want to continue to maintain that open resistance system because we are going to get fire into it sooner or later.
So less suppression.
Pardon?
So less suppression.
Less suppression, more planned use of fire after we've restored the resistance.
But it's not practical to think that we can actually treat
No,
all of that land.
that's absolutely correct.
So fire is our friend.
Some places in fire, yeah. But this gets into a really deep
Sorry.
policy topic, but yes, you're absolutely correct. We're never going to be able to treat all of the frequent fire forests that we have altered. And so we are going to have to look at where we can afford to let it go. And yeah.
So
Peter.
what's the economic model for the Savannah forest then? What's the landowner going to do?
I was wishing no one was going to ask me that.
Thank you, Peter.
I think there are things that we can do. I think you can manage some of those frequent fire forests for some economic returns. And, the ultimate model of the frequent fire forest is the longleaf pine forest. And you can manage the longleaf pine forest with both fire and with timber harvesting simultaneously. And your challenge, your generation's challenge, and DNR's challenge is to develop the model for doing that in our ponderosa pine forest. But basically, you can do both. And they do both in longleaf pine. Longleaf pine is really a neat system, incidentally. It's the bookend of frequent fire systems. It requires burning every 2 to 3 years. And if it doesn't get burnt every 2 or 3 years, it begins to change into something else. And so, it is sort of the ultimate example of a system that is really dependent on frequent fire. And they do manage that forest for wood products at the same time that they're managing it for fire. So you can do both. We haven't figured out how to do that yet with the ponderosa pine, but I believe we can.
And the last thing I'll say, unless you can manage this disturbance every 2 or 3 years, you'll get a whole bunch of fir growing in amongst the ponderosas, right?
Right.
Taking over, essentially.
It'll do it again.
Crowding out the bottom of the understory and
Yeah.
like eastern Oregon.
Yep, absolutely. So, I advocate restoring resistant conditions in as much of it as we can possibly reach and are willing to reach as a society. But it isn't going to be anywhere near enough.
No, and there's a lot of emotion about fire
Yeah,
out there.
that's right.
Talk about it's a social science. There's a lot of emotion on the landscape about letting it burn.
Yep. That could be the topic of several evenings. Okay, 2 other things I want to talk about briefly. Climate change. One of the things I want you to know is that of all the forest regions, significant forest regions in the world that I know, this region is probably the most vulnerable of any I know to climate change and to invasive species. So people, what are you talking about? I mean, this is a very productive forest. It's going to rain all the time still, under climate change, things will just grow better. So what is it you're uptight about? And the problem for us, one of the problems is the fact that we are so dependent on a single species. Imagine if we were to lose Douglas fir, which is the key species in our low elevation forests, both the managed forests and the wild forests. Where would we be? So we are very dependent on a very small set of species, evergreen conifers. Now, what makes us vulnerable to climate change is we are a Mediterranean climate. And so under the climate change scenarios, it's going to continue to rain, no problem with that, but it isn't going to rain anymore in the summer. So summer precipitation is none of the models say it's going to increase. So the temperatures are getting warmer. We're getting the same amount of precipitation as the summer as we were. That means we're getting drier. We're getting greater moisture deficits. So we have a real problem because with climate change, our summers are going to be hotter, drier longer throughout a year. Whoa. And this has a very profound effect on, of course, the biota. For example, hemlock grows some of the places, some of the reasons, let's just say, the summer drought and topographic variability makes a big difference in both the way the forests grow and in what species can be present there. So there are direct impacts on the trees themselves and all of the other elements of biota, but also there's the indirect effect that longer, hotter, drier summers are going to have on fire. So an established forest has a great deal of ability to tolerate change. All right? But if you disrupt it, so it has to go through a reproductive cycle, it is at its most vulnerable from an environmental point of view. And I think that we are going to experience climate change most profoundly, and certainly in the near term, in the form of altered disturbance regimes. More fire, more windstorms, more insect outbreaks. And obviously, longer, hotter, drier summers for us means we're going to have more fire. And that's going to be a problem. In the case of the older forests, about the only thing we can try to do is to minimize fire. Detect it, suppress it. In the case of the managed forests, there are other things that we can do. We can, for example, begin to diversify those forests. And one of my favorite proposals right now, although nobody does it, is to purposely begin to incorporate more hardwoods, more deciduous hardwoods into our managed forests. That would reduce their flammability. That would reduce the amount of water they would use. That would increase the diversity for biological diversity. So, anyway, we are very vulnerable to climate change because of the summer dry period and its great significance for both impacting the physiology of all the organisms and also affecting the major disturbance regime, fire. Invasives, the reason invasives are such a threat to us, if I had one thing I could do, they'd say, Jerry, you got one thing you can do to change the law, the international law, it would be to prohibit the movement of live plants or unprocessed wood products between continents. Because biggest single cause of invasives coming into North America has been, can you believe this? Nursery stock. And we're still doing it. We have introduced sudden oak death a dozen times, all the same way. So, if you really want to do something for conservation in the Northwest, do something about the import from other continents of nursery stock, live planting stock. Any questions here before I finish up? Yeah.
I have a question kind of in regards to carbon offsets as a method of kind of mitigating some impacts of climate change and what that might do to not only fire suppression, but also the presence of early seral stage ecosystems, that if there's this effort to really have these forests as kind of this carbon sink, what does that do in the long term for management of having these really important other ecosystems as well, if there's more of a value placed on the forest ecosystems for those functions overall?
And you're asking whether carbon credits would do that?
Yeah, and so kind of like if there's a shift to increasing the use of carbon credits and what that does to other ecosystems.
Yeah, Peter and I were talking about this over dinner before I came, and the issue of carbon in forests is really complex, but yes, you could dramatically increase the amount of carbon stored on the stump over what we have now. So we know, for example, that during the period of the last 150 years during European settlement of the West, that we have dramatically reduced the stock of carbon that's in the forest. And there's no question, particularly and primarily on the west side, that we could dramatically increase the amount of carbon if we grew the forest longer. Is that what you were asking?
Somewhat, but I'm kind of curious as to if that is the goal moving forward, what that does to the importance of having these early several stage ecosystems if we're trying to grow more forests that are bigger and we're placing a value on that politically and maybe devaluing those early several stage environments because they're perceived to not contain as much carbon, and kind of what are some of the implications of potentially that playing out in the future?
Well, I would go back to one of the first principles that I suggested to you, which is, in my opinion, and this is, I would apply this to the federal lands and forest lands in general, we should not be trying to maximize carbon sequestration. We should be thinking about carbon sequestration as part of the overall mix of values that we want to get out of these forests. So I'm opposed to the notion that we should let all of the forests and federal lands grow to be old forests, because we need pre-forest, young forest, mature forest as well. So definitely we should be thinking about carbon, and when we're managing forests, I would really favor markets that in fact encouraged us to use longer rotations, certainly longer than 30 or 35 years, to take advantage of that really rapid accumulation of biomass that occurs over the first, in Douglas fir, 100 or 150 years. Now the situation in the pine and mixed conifer is a different one. And again, if you try to maximize carbon sequestration in those forests, you make them very vulnerable to a boom and bust condition. And you probably can do just about as well by restoring them to a lower but stable stock of carbon. But again, the principle is think about carbon not as a sole objective, but as part of the collective objectives that you're trying to achieve. Okay, well, I think, maybe I'll just, you asked about the Northwest Forest Plan. And, I think there were some really good things we did in the Northwest Forest Plan, but there were some real things that we weren't thinking about as well. We did a really good job of stopping harvesting activity. So we did that, and it was a heroic effort. It took a lot of courage, in fact, to effectively say to the decision makers, people, you can't have 5 billion board feet a year harvested from the federal lands and provide for fish and owls and murrelets. You can't do that. And so we did a good job. Interestingly, we weren't asked to preserve all the old growth forest, and in the Northwest Forest Plan, we didn't. We left some out because we thought there needed to be some additional support for the industry. Well, a bunch of naive scientists got their heads slapped real hard with that, because society, you all said, well, you scientists may think that it's okay to cut some more old growth, but we don't. And we're going to go out and we're going to climb trees and we're going to fly down in front of bulldozers, and if you try to cut old growth, we're not going to let you do it. And so what happened was really interesting. The agencies stopped trying to cut old growth. They didn't tell anybody this. They didn't make any formal change to the plan. They just didn't do it. Because they knew that, we can't run a timber sale program where you got to essentially take a half a platoon of Army soldiers out there and clear out the woods every time you want to go work. You can't do that. That's not socially acceptable. So the federal agencies stopped cutting old forests. So we stopped things. But on the other hand, when we did the Northwest Forest Plan, we weren't thinking about, we thought about, but we were tired. And we didn't have as much science then, and so we didn't really know what to do with the frequent fire forests. So all we did in the Northwest Forest Plan was say that where those are in late successional reserves, you can restore them. But nobody did. Almost nobody did. Nobody wanted to go into an LSR and propose anything, a late successional reserve. And we didn't think at all about early successional. We didn't think about, why would we have to worry about that? The timber industry's out there cutting all this timber. There's going to be early successional all over the place. And then nature's going to create some. They're going to burn some forest down, blow some forest down. We don't need to worry about that. So we didn't even really think about it. That's something that has to be thought about in revising the Northwest Forest Plan. Obviously, one of our key objectives was to arrest the decline of the northern spotted owl. And what's the rule in conservation biology? Preserve the habitat. So we preserved habitat by the millions of acres. And we're growing back habitat by the millions of acres. And we failed because it isn't habitat. We have an invasive owl, a barred owl, that is an extremely aggressive animal. And I'm willing to say outright that this northern spotted owl is going to go extinct as a subspecies unless we shoot barred owls. That's the only way you're going to be able to conserve northern spotted owls. Now, think about that. You guys got to make the decision about that. Are we going to shoot barred owls? There's an experiment going on right now, and fundamentally, it can be a successful way of maintaining northern spotted owls. But do you want to do that? You want to do it in perpetuity? Real challenge. That was one of the places we failed, and we failed in part because we didn't want to believe the barred owl was really going to be that big a problem. Somehow, maybe the barred owl will take the habitat the spotted owl doesn't want. Oh, please. No. Didn't work out. And interestingly, the barred owl is not just a problem for the spotted owl. The barred owl eats everything. It is voracious. It eats everything. It eats squirrels. It eats salamanders. It eats crawfish. It eats fish. It eats bats. So we have a new top predator that's never existed in this region before. We don't know what kind of trophic cascades are going to result from that. It's a real problem. And guess what? Because it eats everything, the barred owl has a small territory, 250 acres, maybe, typical. And it eats everything in it. And because it's a small territory and it's an aggressive bird, it defends that territory aggressively. The spotted owl is a picky eater. It likes flying squirrels. Its territory is 2,500 acres, as an example. And it doesn't defend that. It can't defend a 2,500 acre property or territory aggressively. And it's not in its nature to do so anyway. So, you want to eliminate barred owls by shooting them? You got to shoot 10 pairs of barred owls for every single pair of spotted owl that you're trying to protect. Oh man, that's a lot of raptors. So, anyway, Northwest Forest Plan achieved some things, failed in other regards. The challenge now is for the Forest Service to take a comprehensive look at the area of the Northwest Forest Plan and develop essentially some guidelines as to how the agency is going to deal with issues, such as the barred owl, such as early successional habitat, so that it can then proceed with the individual forest plans that it wants to do. And as I said, think about it, talk about it, how difficult it is in a diverse group of people representing all kinds of stakeholder interests to agree on alternatives which are legal and scientifically credible. Because most of the time you'll find the people that are participating in that want to change the boundaries of what's legal, for example, or want to argue about what the scientific facts are. That's going to be the real challenge. In effect, the Forest Service wants to do its plans on a forest-by-forest basis. And issues like the northern spotted owl, you can't deal with on a forest-by-forest basis. Now, just one last word about that. The Fish and Wildlife Service has a recovery plan for the northern spotted owl. And that's a really good starting point if the Forest Service would take that as the template, the larger template on which to begin to develop its plan. But that's very difficult for an agency to do, to accept the product of another agency as fundamentally the framework of what it's going to have to do as a management agency. Okay, enough of me. I've burned up 3/4 of the time. So what would you like to ask?
What's the current status of the position on logging after forest fires if there's salvageable timber?
Good question. I should have said something about salvage, but I wrote a book with 2 other people about salvage. It's published by Island Press, but the gist of it is, after you have a fire, the first question that you ask is, what was my management objectives for that property before the fire? If you're a Weyerhaeuser company, you know what they are. They're economic. And so you salvage what you can and then plant it back and get going again. But if you're a national forest, if you're the Willamette National Forest, and your management objective had to do with biological diversity, then, wait a minute, is this going to be ecologically beneficial? Is it going to contribute to my bottom line of sustaining biological diversity and ecological processes? And the answer is generally going to be salvage will not do that. We salvage for one reason. We salvage for economic reasons. Salvage almost never, ever contributes directly to ecological recovery. It's almost always a tax on recovery. And so, you need to recognize that. Now, sometimes people equate salvage with reforestation. And those are 2 very different things, although the Forest Service won't reforest anything it didn't salvage. It's got a basic rule about that now. Didn't do that in the old days. But bottom line, salvage is done primarily for economic reasons. It may contribute indirectly to recovery if you get money that you can use to do some repair work elsewhere within the burn. But for example, salvaging the Eagle Creek fire down in the Columbia Gorge, quite apart from the land designation, isn't going to help in the recovery of that forest system. It's going to help in recovering owl habitat or any other damn thing. And in fact, it's going to disrupt it. So, no. You know, the big battle that we had to do with the Biscuit Fire down in southern Oregon a decade or more ago now. And they were going to do a big salvage there. And I rarely comment on environmental impact statements, but I did on that one. And then I ended up with the regional forester out looking at this. And they had proposed a very large salvage. And I finally said to her, okay, you have the authority to come and salvage in this late successional reserve. But don't you ever tell me you've done it for ecological reasons or you'll see me in court. And she didn't. They never justified it based on ecology. They did on economics. So, very simple. Salvage is fundamentally economic and rarely is going to provide a positive contribution to ecology. That clear enough? Okay. Other questions? I've worn you out. Yeah.
What method would you use for the Eagle Creek fire? If you had complete control over the landscape, what would you do?
In the case of the Eagle Creek fire, which is down the Columbia Gorge, it's obvious you have to do something where human health and safety is involved, where, you know, infrastructure is involved. And so there, you know, your activity would be to remove hazardous materials. But the vast majority, probably 95% of the area is in designated wilderness. And there's never any authority to go in and do that kind of activity in a wilderness. So, and Congressman Walden knows that. But he had to introduce the legislation he introduced because some of his constituents wanted him to. So, other questions?
I've got one more for you, Jerry.
Shoot.
So fire is a very emotional and policy-rich debate and what to do after fire. You've just been talking about it. The Wolverine fire that burned on the northwest shore of Chelan in 2015 threatened the settlement of Stehekin and burned some of the very steep hillsides going down into the lake. That region has got shallow soils to begin with. What's the fate of those landscapes, and is there anything that can be done for those landscapes that have burned severely to keep the soil on the slope?
Well, I think in cases like that, efforts at revegetation. And, you know, shrubs are as good as trees in that case, in terms of stabilizing soil. So you know, as far as I can see, revegetation activities to speed that recovery process of woody plants would be what you'd be trying to do.
So you talked about this early serial development there in the blast zone of St. Helens, which is benefited by the high rainfall of the western slope of the Cascades. However, the area that I just mentioned is on the east slope of the Cascades. Is natural vegetation going to occur in, like with brush and grasses and other things there rapidly enough to hold the soil, or does it require introduction?
Well, I'd want to look at it on the ground, but I would say that it will undergo pretty rapid recovery, vegetative-wise, from natural. But again, you might want to accelerate that or enrich it simply through some artificial revegetation.
Like aerial seeding or something like that?
Well, I don't know. I'm not really. In general, we feel that aerial seeding is a pretty wasteful way of using seed, and so growing stock. And in general, we would also say that, if you're seeding grasses, it's probably not a good idea. That, ultimately, while those may be helpful in the very short term, they may also be problems in the long term.
Competition-wise?
Yeah. So, we did that at Mount St. Helens. We seeded an immense amount of grass because that's all the SCS knew how to do, Soil Conservation Service. And seeding grasses in conditions like that sort of not helpful.
Long term.
Yeah. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Yeah, one more.
So you said with the biggest policy change you would advise would basically prevention of invasive species by not allowing live plants to come here. So we have a lot of current invasive species that a lot of agencies use herbicides on. Do you have given that herbicides obviously put pollutants in the soil, degrade diversity, what's your thoughts on how we tackle some of our current invasives?
Well, I don't just say never use herbicides, not ever. I think, we're dealing with some invasives that we really don't have any alternatives. So I think, particularly ground-based applications of herbicides. But that's not what's happening on the lands that belong to the TMOs and REITs. We're getting massive multiple applications of herbicides from helicopters. So I'm not opposed in principle to the use of herbicides, but that kind of very broad scale application in essentially as a regular routine, not appropriate. So it's stunning. On some of the lands in Oregon, I couldn't believe it. They were using 6 applications of herbicides. 2 of them before planting, and then 4 more after planting, including 2 that were intended to kill the herbs. Whoa! Boy, I got to tell you, that sure simplifies early successional habitat. Quick. So, well, you guys have been really good. You've been patient, and you've all stayed awake and listened, and I appreciate that. I do want to again just emphasize to you the social nature of what you're about. You know that. You know that better than I do. But as we look at this century, and we take, a backward look at the last century, it's pretty clear to me that there's more uncertainty associated with society and decisions that we make as a society than there is with the environment. So in your focus on the environmental changes that take place, don't lose sight of the massive social changes that are occurring and interacting with that. That's just the reality, and I think we can find ways of dealing with most of these things from a scientific or technical point of view. The choices aren't going to be fun. It's going to have to be a whole lot more emphasis on engineering, ecological engineering. How do we maintain actual functions out there? How do we maintain protected watersheds in the face of the changes that occur? But it is the social changes that are going to determine the future of our public lands, among others. And so don't ignore that. Very scary times we're in. And participate. Participate. And don't assume that your public lands are always going to be there, because if you don't fight for them, they won't be. So, all right. Thank you. Oh, wonderful. One other little book that you might be interested in is this one. It's way overpriced, but it's an Island Press book. It's called People, Forest, and Change, Lessons from the Pacific Northwest. And like any multi-authored book, whether chapters are by different people, it's highly variable in quality. Some of the chapters really suck. But there's some really good chapters in here and some really good thinking about future of the Northwestern public lands. So I just wanted you to be aware of this book, People, Forests, and Change, Island Press. So, thanks.